when you're at services.
I think it's,
Okay.
yep, I think it's time.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's program of Cocktail Judaism. This is brought to you from Congregation Beth-El in Indianapolis. I am Dennis Sasso, Senior Rabbi of the congregation, and along with me, my wife and colleague, Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, Rabbi Emerita of the congregation. And before we start, I want to wish a happy birthday to Jackie Goldstein, our producer and communications director at Congregation Beth-El. Today is Jackie's birthday. L'chaim, appropriate for a cocktail Judaism experience. Tonight we are delighted and honored to welcome our very special guest, Martha Hoover. Martha Hoover is the founder and president of Patachu Inc. She owns various successful restaurants in Indianapolis, Cafes Patachu, Petit Chou Bistro and Champagne Bar, Napoli's Pizzeria, Public Greens, and Bar 114. Patachu Inc. was founded in 1989, and Martha partnered with local vendors and farmers years before the phrase farm to table was first uttered. Today, Patachu Inc. supports more Indiana family farms than all the other restaurants in Indianapolis combined. Patachu Inc. restaurants compost, recycle, and upcycle. Plasticware bottles have been banned for almost 7 years and plastic straws for over 2 years. In 2013, Martha created the Patachu Foundation to feed healthy meals to food insecure children in Indianapolis. And to date, more than 150,000 healthy, nutritious meals have been served by the Patachu Foundation to children in the community who live with pervasive food insecurity. Martha Hoover is a James Beard Culinary Award semi-finalist for Best Restaurateur. On a personal note, Martha and her husband John are dear friends of ours and members of Beth-El, where John has served on the board of directors. They're proud parents and grandparents. Their children, Sarah and Tom Sachs, and their grandson, Guy, live in New York. Sarah is an art curator, and Tom is a well-known artist. And Rachel and Dennis Lekic and their daughter, Delphine, or Fifi, are part of our congregation's early childhood program. She is in the ECC Latkes. They live in Indianapolis. Rachel is Director of Sustainability for Patachu Foundation, and she is a PhD candidate at Harvard. Dennis works in the Lekic family business, and son, David, is a chef who lives in LA. Let me welcome you all once again as we join this conversation with Martha Hoover. So, Martha, why don't we begin by asking you to tell us about your personal and professional trajectory, what brought you to the food and restaurant business and to the founding of Patachu?
Well, I opened my first restaurant in 1989. I'm sure several of you have heard this before. If you've ever heard me speak, I normally say that I opened the restaurant in 1989, having never worked in a restaurant, and not knowing that I was pregnant with my third child, my son, David, who you just spoke about. So if ever there was a recipe for disaster, that would have been it. But some 30 years later and 12 restaurant locations later, the formula seems to have worked. You were correct, and I thank you for that very generous introduction, Dennis. You're correct. We were the first in the state to introduce farm to table, and it was years. It was almost 20 years before that phrase was uttered by anyone. And today we do support a tremendous number of local farms, local vendors, and local suppliers. As of right before March 16th, we operated 12 locations spread over 5 different concepts, and had on the morning of March 16th, we had 325 employees. And then, of course, COVID happened, the mandates happened, and the world changed, and we now have a very different company than we had that morning.
Thank you, Martha. So I'm curious about the perspective on the restaurant pre-COVID, some of the economic issues and difficulties before this pandemic, and how that has changed post-COVID or in the midst of COVID. What are some of the new challenges that are presented?
Well, that's a really complex question that needs remarkable detail, both in perspective and looking forward. The restaurant model has always been filled with risk, as everyone knows. But over the last 10 years, we have seen, in particular, all over the United States, in every city, whether it's major cities, tertiary cities, secondary cities, we have seen an explosion of restaurants, particularly independent restaurants. But truthfully, the restaurant model itself has had remarkable dysfunction to it. And the crisis of COVID only made the dysfunction more pronounced. And as a result, what has happened over the last 2 months is there's been a public acknowledgement, I think, both from restaurant owners and operators and from the public that has supported restaurants, that there is a dysfunctional model at foot. So I guess you're asking what some of the dysfunctionality is. And very briefly, it's that restaurants are not as profitable as people think they are. And by people, I mean members of the public and members of the restaurant community. So when I first started the restaurant, restaurants were risky, even in 30 years ago, but the level of reward was higher than the level of reward is today. We have seen levels of profitability fall over the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, you could count on a successful restaurant model spinning off about 15 to 20% in profitability. Today, the most successful restaurants in the United States, the most successful restaurants spin off less than 10%. Usually between 5 and 9% is the industry average. But there's a little bit, if I could peel back the curtain just a little bit before we start talking about profitability, real profitability versus presumed or assumed profitability. One of the things that I think most people don't recognize is the strength and power of the restaurant industry itself. Do you mind if I talk about that for a minute? Is that okay? So in doing research, especially as COVID started to hit restaurants, we were basically, the restaurant industry were the canaries in the coal mines. We were the first to get hit and will probably be the last to fully recover. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that the restaurant industry is the largest employer of people in the United States. We are often not recognized as being that large and that powerful of an industry. But so to put it in perspective, there are 15 recognized airline carriers in the United States that qualified for a separate bailout than the PPP. 15 airlines. There are, by comparison, over 670,000 restaurants in the United States. The airline industry supports, the airline industry brings in a couple $100 billion a year, which is a lot of money. And it supports about 750,000 employees. However, the restaurant industry has an impact on our economy of over $1 trillion every year and employs 15 million people. Within the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, since the beginning of March, 80% of employees in the United States who were laid off and applied for unemployment benefits, 80% were people associated with the restaurant industry. So the industry itself is huge. As I said, we are the largest private employer in the United States. The issue is that you could probably name every airline. At least you could name the 6 major ones. You could also name the 3 major cruise ship lines, but you would be really want to be able to name 675,000 restaurants in the United States. And that, just as a matter of perspective, I think says a lot.
So how is the PPP plan, the Payment Protection Plan, helpful to restaurants and not helpful to restaurants? And how,
So,
differ from other for-profit small businesses?
So the PPP, it stands for Payroll Protection Plan. It was a relief program put into effect at the end of March as an emergency measure to not help businesses, but to help people get back to work. And the plan's intent was wonderful, and it certainly works for a lot of businesses. I know a lot of people who applied and received PPP assistance, and it has been a remarkable assistance and lifeline for their businesses. However, it does not work for the restaurant model. First and foremost, the plan, the model required payback within 8 weeks of receiving whatever money that you received, if you were lucky enough to receive money. And the problem with that is that restaurants are under a mandated close. So you have the PPP also requires you to spend the money in a certain formula and to spend it within 8 weeks. And that was created, the PPP was created at a time when no one knew how long this would be, but people in Washington, people everywhere, thought that it would be a 4 to 6 week problem. Well, we are now going into month 3, and the PPP basically expires on June 7th. So it does the restaurant world no good if you can't be in business and you can't make sales and you can't hire people back, then there's no real value to having won the PPP relief. The restaurant industry, unlike most industries, is an industry that we cannot serve restaurant workers can't go home and work from home. They can't take their laptop and get their work done. They have to work out of a physical space known as a restaurant for a variety of reasons having to do with Board of Health and equipment, and that's where, historically, that's where customers have come to. And that model has been shattered with the corona. So the PPP does not assist restaurants the way it assists other businesses. And it is something that we realize that we cannot rely on to get restaurants back into business.
Can you also just add something about the difference in large corporations' tax relief and benefits as compared to the smaller restaurants?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the level of taxation placed against the restaurants is considerably higher over 10 times higher than it is for other major industries. Industries that do not add as much to the bottom line of our country and do not employ as many people. I talked about the airline industry and the cruise line industry. Those industries are taxed at a less than 1%, whereas restaurant industries, the average across the country, is taxed between 18 and 20%. So there is a remarkable disparity from day one. Even if Corona or COVID didn't exist, restaurants work under different burdens than other industries. And the burdens fall to the restaurant owners. And it all goes back to one of the reasons why profitability is not as keen as it should be. But there are other things besides the taxation structure that create some dysfunction in the restaurant model. And one of those things is that, and you all know this from going to the grocery stores yourself, the price of food varies. Last week, avocados were selling for over $4, whatever the unit was. 2 weeks before that, avocados were selling in the $2.50 range. So what does that mean? That means that product changes pricing depending on a variety of markets and a variety of reasons, including customer demand. So when you go to, whether you shop at Kroger or Whole Foods, the pricing varies and it changes from day to day and week to week. Menu pricing is fixed. Restaurants cannot change their menu pricing to reflect the true cost of products. And that really is very dangerous for restaurants because we're always working to catch up. And then there's a secondary issue, and that is that there is this universality of menu pricing so that pricing does not really accurately reflect what it costs to get food in a restaurant to serve that plate of food. It more is a reflection, menu pricing is more a reflection of what all markets bear, meaning that there is a bit of a universal price, whether you're in Florida or Tennessee or Indiana, you know that when you go to a restaurant, that your price for your salmon dinner, for example, will be somewhere between $28 and $34. Now, it makes no sense when you think about it that that price exists, whether or not you are sourcing the finest salmon and really careful with your product, and whether or not you're a restaurant that pays people above livable wage, it has benefits, or if you're a restaurant, a restaurant chain that gets the cheapest commodity food and does not really take care of their people. So that's one issue impacting profitability and security for restaurants. And here is what happened with COVID. I think people within the last couple of years were understanding with all the talk, the public debate about minimum wage and whether or not minimum wage needed to be increased and how to define the difference between minimum wage and livable wage, or what we call survivor wage. I think that people were just waking up to that issue and understanding that the vast majority of restaurant workers did not even make livable wage, and that it required restaurant workers, the vast majority of them, to work 2 and 3 jobs just to have a standard of living that, quite honestly, in a first world country is embarrassing. But beyond that, what we see is that the livable wage, I got a little adrift. I'm sorry, Sandy, that I'm not really answering your question directly. But what we've seen with COVID is that the people on the bottom rungs of the restaurant ladder are the ones who have lost their jobs the fastest, the quickest. In fact, the vast majority of people who were first laid off in the restaurant industry were Hispanics and people of color, people who are normally described as being in the margins anyhow.
Martha, we have read and we conversed with you about the creation of an organization called the Independent Restaurant Coalition. What
Yes.
brought about that need, and how does that differ from the National Restaurant Association?
The National Restaurant Association is a trade organization, a lobbyist group that has been around forever. I've been a member for 30 years. But as most large national lobbying organizations, the NRA, Restaurant Not Rifle, represents those with the greatest amount of access. And those with the greatest amount of access happen to be the largest chain restaurants, publicly traded restaurants. So the reason why the Independent Restaurant Coalition was formed is, quite honestly, the NRA, again, Restaurant Not Rifle, did not truly represent the small restaurateurs such as myself. Or even restaurants that are restaurant groups that are smaller than Pas de Choux. So what happened was the White House, was kind of the moment of reckoning. The White House put together, in conjunction with the creation of the Payroll Protection Plan, the White House put together a committee of restaurateurs who could weigh into the needs of the needs of the restaurant industry and how they may be met by the PPP. And quite honestly, that committee, there were no people of color on the committee and there were no women on the committee. And egregiously, there were no people on the committee who had restaurants that were Pas de Choux restaurants. There were no people on the committee that represented restaurants that did not have investor groups, venture groups, equity groups, or were publicly traded. So the voice of the restaurant, the average restaurateur, was totally ignored in creating the PPP. And as a result of that, several restaurateurs led by Tom Colicchio, who is not only a celebrity restaurateur, but also a remarkable activist and advocate for the industry, put together with some of his chef and restaurateur colleagues an organization that better addresses the needs of small and independent restaurants.
Let's talk a little bit about advocacy, because you are not only the owner of the restaurants, but also the Pas de Choux Foundation. And the title of this evening's program is not only the restaurant industry, but hunger and food. Could you tell us a little bit about the important work of the Pas de Choux Foundation and about your advocacy work, and what can people do to help in that advocacy effort?
Yeah, we're really happy to have a couple of your board members here.
Well, I was going to say, Sandy was a founding board member. Julie Eskenazi and April Sasso are current board members, and they could answer this question as easily, if not better, than I could. I formed the Pas de Choux Foundation 6 years ago when it became just absolutely unbearable when I realized the level of childhood food insecurity that existed within Marion County. And I thought it was absolutely horrendous and unacceptable in every way that 80% of the children who attended the Indianapolis public schools, a school system that is the major school system in Indianapolis, the capital city of Indiana, a historically agricultural state situated in the middle of the United States, arguably the finest first world country ever to exist in history, that 80% of those children went home and did not know whether they would be able to find food, no fault of their own. They did not know where their next meal was coming from if schools were not operating. And of course, it also became apparent that the value of the meals that these children were eating through the school programs were nutritionally just terrible. So we decided that we could do something about this, and we created the Pas de Choux Foundation. The foundation started small. Our first meal service was less than 30 people, 30 students. We now serve at 8 schools or community centers since schools are closed. And over the last year, we've expanded our footprint, our service footprint, and have served between 1,500 and 2,000 meals a week. On March 20th, we went into hyperdrive because the need of the community with the closings of IPS, the needs of the community, and not just the closings of IPS, but what we were talking about earlier, the fact that so many parents who were employed, parents of students in IPS were losing their jobs. They were being furloughed, they were being laid off, they were being terminated from jobs that inadequately paid in the first place. So our needs for feeding increased hugely. And as of 6 weeks ago, we have been feeding about 4,000 meals a week, sometimes a little more. The first couple of weeks after the mandated closures of schools, we were feeding approximately 6,000 children a week. And I know that sounds like a huge amount, and it is a huge amount, especially for an organization such as ours that really is small and basically new. But that represents a drop in, not a bucket, but a drop in an ocean of need in our own city. So if anyone wants to help, we always accept people's time, talent, and treasure. Right now, what we really need is treasure, which is a fancy word of saying money, because those contributions are going to our budget, which is, of course, extremely compressed due to the high level of need in our community.
Can you tell people how to send in a contribution?
Absolutely. They can go online to the PottershoeFoundation.org, and there are very simple directions and buttons to push where you could find out more information about our programs, what we do on a daily basis, and you'd have opportunities to donate as well.
Let me, okay, it's very hard. No, I was going to say.
You were going to say.
No, I was going to say that there are people who have not been involved in this. The quality of the food that these children receive and what they learn about food preparation and healthy, nutritious food is really, really extraordinary. I mean,
thank you, Sandy. That really is something that distinguishes the Potter Shoe Foundation from other organizations that are feeding children. And just if I could take 2 minutes to give a little story. When I first started the Potter Shoe Foundation, I was at the Bonner Center, and I was helping with service in the afternoon. And I remember the date as if, I remember the experience, and I remember the date as if it were yesterday. It was October 3rd. And the reason I remember that is because that's my son's birthday. So we were there feeding 30 children. And the children we were feeding, it literally was our first or second service from the beginning of the foundation. So we were feeding the children, and the children were asking for seconds, and they were asking for thirds, and we saw a lot of children hoarding food and sticking it in their pockets. And of course, living in a bubble, I made the comment to one of the school officials who was there helping me that I was so happy. We had been told that kids would not eat healthy, nutritious food, just to feed them junk, that's what they were used to. And I literally was patting myself on the back, and I said, you know what? I knew that kids would naturally eat this wonderfully prepared food made from all this farm fresh stuff and great vegetables and fruit and organic this and organic that. And the teacher basically said, hey, calm down, lady. They love your food. It is really good. And we think it's amazing that you're serving quality food. But I want you to know the circumstances. This is the first Monday that these children have been back since fall break. And fall break occurred at the end of September. And what that means was that their parents' SNAP, food stamps, also known as SNAP, had expired. They usually last, the benefit usually only lasts for about 2 weeks. It's not enough to go through a whole month worth of food. So the parents have not had the means to buy food for the kids. And the kids have relied on schools feeding them breakfast and lunch. But because of a fall break where the schools were out for an entire week, the children did not get regular meals. So they have not had breakfast or lunch for over a week. And let me go on to tell you what today's lunch was, Martha. It was a half of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on white bread that was made in a factory in Reading, Pennsylvania. And it was put in cellophane and frozen and shipped. And along with that, for their fruit was a fruit roll-up and a box of milk. And that was the meal. So in terms of perspective, yes, we do feed children really wholesome, high-quality food. Everything is made from scratch. And beyond that, we talk to children about the food in a very non-paternalistic, non-judgmental way, and we involve them in the meal that unite the children to the food that they are feeding. And our volunteers do an amazing job of creating relationships with the children to change their experience at the table and to improve it. Our goal all along has always been, if a child in these classes and in our programming, that if a child down the road is given an option between an apple and a bag of chips, that they know automatically that the apple will fuel them and the chips will be bad. So that's what we do. And I hope that that anecdote means something to people, because it's really why we're doing what we're doing.
Thank you, Martha. And we encourage you all to support the Patachou Foundation. Just want you to know that in appreciation for your participation in this program, we will send a contribution from the Sidney Mauer Fund to feed the hungry of our congregation.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Not expected and truly appreciated.
Happy to do that. So, we're supposed to both do this interview, so it's hard to know who goes next, but thank you, Dennis. So look, you have a lot of consumers on this call, people who go out to eat a lot in restaurants. So, excuse me, how do you see the short-term recovery? What will it, excuse me, what will it be like for restaurants, for consumers, for employees? You know, what's the near future and the long-term future? I'm not sure you can go that far, but what's the near future like?
Well, actually, I am remarkably, you know what, our company's slogan has been for the last 20-some years, two things that are relevant today. One, we've said since day one that we are a student union for adults, which really goes to the heart of what restaurants are. They are community hubs. Secondly, one of our slogans has been that we are radically different and radically better than other restaurants. And we are in a variety of ways, from the quality of our food and our food sourcing, to our customer service, to how we treat our customers and how we treat our community and our sustainability platform. But today I added something new to that slogan. I said that we are radically different, we are radically better, and we are radically optimistic. I believe that restaurants will recover. I do not think they will recover quickly. I do not think that they will recover in the same way. No restaurant that closed on March 16th will reopen whenever they reopen to the same business model. But restaurants, by their very definition, are incredibly resilient organizations. You have to be when you have margins as thin as they are, and when you count on so much that you can't control. You can't control the weather, you can't control competition, you can't control how consumers make their choices. So you really are at the mercy of a lot of things out of your control. But this much is, I really believe, really true. Restaurants are resilient organizations. The real question is, how resilient are consumers? And I believe that a majority of consumers will want to get back to some of the joys of their life. COVID has created a hard pause. that has allowed everyone to really recalibrate what's important. And I believe one of the things that's most important is what restaurants do, and that is they provide community over food. And as far as I know from everything I've ever read, people have been celebrating, people have been celebrating, people grieve together, people do everything together, and the crux of it is usually over food. You don't just have to be Jewish, by the way, to love everything about the table. And I do believe that that 2020, I said this to my staff today, 2020 can be defined as the worst year of our lives, or it can be defined as the beginning of the decade of connectivity. And I am an eternal optimist. I'm not a silly person at all. I believe in planning. I believe in planning for uncertainty. I believe in making decisions that really benefit the whole and not just one person. And I think that restaurants will come back. I think we will see a new level of connectivity. That's why Zoom is so successful. People refuse to just sit at home and be by themselves or be with the one or two people that they have been forced to social distance with. And I think people are desperate for human connection.
And food is the
I'm sorry, Dennis, you're breaking up.
Yes, I'm hearing a buzzing in the back myself.
It's an alarm. It's okay.
Okay. So I think that we have heard a lot of nourishing and nurturing information. Some of it has alerted us to some sober realities, but at the same time, Martha has given us a message of hopeful anticipation. Perhaps there are some questions among you that you would like to raise for our guest to address. If you have a question, you can put it on the chat and we will attempt to respond to it, to read it. I think that George Kelly is going to be reading our chat questions. So let me just pause for a few moments and if you have a question.
Well, Martha, while we're waiting for some questions, are you willing to tell us why you chose Patachou as the name for your restaurant?
Well, yes. So years ago, after graduating from law school, I was hired by the Marion County Prosecutor's Office to be in the nation's second sex crimes unit. That was back in the very early 80s when sex crimes was considered new and novel. The idea to protect women and children against predators and abusers was not done historically. So we created this sex crimes unit. And I used to, actually our prosecutor then was Steve Goldsmith, who I believe was a member of the Temple at one point. Was he not when he lived in Indianapolis? I worked for Steve. I was one of his sex crimes prosecutors. And I used to go into his office frequently to bother him with my harebrained ideas, one of which I used to always say to him, if you could teach people to read and give people opportunities to get employment, I think that we would have engagement and we would lower crime. And he used to tell me that I was a cream puff and that my ideas were crazy. Well, lo and behold, 25 years ago when I established the Patachou Foundation, Steve Goldsmith was actually a founding board member. And as many of you know, he also taught at Harvard. And he has said on numerous occasions that the ideas I had as a cream puff were actually, it's where criminal justice is right now. So cream puff in French is Patachou. And that's how I named my company, Cafe Patachou. I have another question. Do you want me to read it, George, or are you going to read it?
I can go ahead and read it. It says, "Hi, Martha, Rob Kirsch here, Steve's brother. Any new or exciting restaurant concepts you are working on that you can share with us?"
Yes. Wow. Did I pay someone to ask that? We decided, we had a family Zoom call literally the Sunday the 15th of March. we knew on the 16th the governor was going to mandate restaurants to be closed. And quite honestly, it was extraordinarily disheartening. It was tragically sad. We got together with my whole family as you know you do when you go through these moments, and they really bolstered me up. And within an hour or so, we had devised a new restaurant called Apocalypse Burger. One of my son-in-laws is an artist. He quickly drew the logo. One of my son is a chef. He and I worked on a menu, and by 9 o'clock at night, I had my trademark lawyer on the phone, and we papered that up, and we plan on opening. We're waiting this week for health department and the fire marshal to come by. It is a carry-out only restaurant, reduced contact, very simple menu, very approachable price-wise, and it's called Apocalypse Burger. So out of this dust, something good is happening in our universe. Something creative.
Where are you?
I'm sorry, Sandy?
Yeah, where is it located?
49th and Penn.
Oh, right there.
There's another question, I believe.
Right. Claudette asks, the city is proposing to close streets in order to increase outdoor dining. Will you be affected by this plan?
I'm sorry, the city is what? Say that.
Streets to
I'm sorry, my husband.
more dining?
John, I can't hear, hon. That's Zoom, working at home, and he can't hear me because the water's on. Okay, go ahead.
So the city is proposing to close streets in order to increase outdoor dining. Will you be affected by this?
Well, I mean, let's talk about that. People drive to restaurants, so yes, but in the world of COVID, we have never seen more activity outside of cars, right? We've never seen more people biking and walking. Luckily, several of our locations are in extremely walkable and bike-friendly neighborhoods. Anything we can do to increase business, and that for now means increasing our footprints of our sidewalks, makes a lot of sense to us, at least over the summer. So I'm not opposed to that. I think it's a really good thought, very, very forward-thinking idea.
Okay, I personally have a question. That term farm to table seems to be becoming a marketing strategy for people. Do restaurateurs have issues with the way some other restaurants are throwing that around right now?
Restaurateurs, such as myself, have huge issues with it, but I will tell you who even has greater issues with it are farmers. Farmers who have sold maybe one time 5 years ago to a restaurant that is using it as we call greenwashing. I don't know if you're familiar with the term greenwashing, but it refers to using sustainability, whatever, if it's sourcing or environmental sustainability, as part of your marketing when you are not really authentically practicing that level of sustainability. So yes, I mean, we all know, for instance, that the term artisanal cannot be applied at an Olive Garden. They're too large to be practicing artisanal anything. And for them to use that word is offensive to people such as myself who work really hard to practice their craft in a way that we've been practicing for 30 years. It's the same way with the term farm to table. It has become ubiquitous and almost meaningless. And yes, it is remarkably offensive that restaurants are using the term, and there's no transparency regarding their sourcing, and there's no agency or really any certification. Anyone can use it, and customers are meant to figure it out themselves. And most people do not understand the complexities of sourcing, and so they assume that what a restaurant says is accurate.
Okay, another question coming in. As someone who is in the age group most susceptible to COVID, can you reassure me that restaurants will once again be safe to dine in?
Well, I am absolutely in that age group. And of course, restaurants, here's the truth about restaurants. Quality restaurants practice sanitation that is beyond what anyone at home is practicing. And due to COVID, any good restaurant to great restaurant will practice enhanced sanitation. And there's a huge difference between being clean and being sanitary. Restaurants such as mine have put enhanced sanitation practices in place since Ebola. We have been practicing, we have hand washing standards, we have use of chemical standards, we have standards that have been in place for years. But of course, with COVID, all of those have been underscored, enhanced. I know that I can only speak to my own restaurant. We have a committee in my company at a leadership level that has been for the last 3 weeks, even though we are not operational at restaurants. We have done deep cleanings every 2 weeks in all the restaurants. We also are doing trainings with staff through Zoom to talk about enhanced protocol. No one will be coming into the restaurant who has not been temped. We are providing safe places in our restaurants proper for staff when they come in to remove their streetwear and to put on clean wear. Masks, gloves, hair nets are required. Alarms are being set so that people have to remove their gloves, hand wash, sanitize their hands, dry their hands, put on a fresh pair of gloves. We are really, and I think most restaurants are hyper alert that what customers need to come back is real transparency and how secure the restaurants are going to be. At the same time, we realize that customers don't want to walk into a surgical field. So we need to here's the thing. Restaurants exist the exact opposite of what social distancing is requiring. So we are balancing as a company when to properly open, because there is a point where financially it is not viable for us to open if social distancing mandates require us to be at 25% capacity or 50% capacity. At some point, we know we will get beyond this. At some point, there will be a vaccine. At some point, herd immunity will take place. At some point, antibody testing will happen. In fact, I get tested tomorrow at 5 o'clock. At some point, restaurants and customers will have to make a leap of faith and know that the restaurants that they trust are doing the right thing regarding sanitation.
George, I saw a couple of other questions emerge there.
I was trying to keep it within this framework. So we have a question like, how likely do you think that dining inside will return before we have an effective treatment for the virus? If not likely, how can restaurants survive with social distance requirements for tables? Will it cause a price increase? And not only to your restaurants, but those that typically serve less well-off customers?
Food pricing, menu pricing, accessibility are all issues of tremendous importance to me. But the bottom line is, I think there needs to be, and I use this word a lot in talking to media across the country and on national Zoom calls, there needs to be a reckoning. The reckoning is that menu pricing, regardless of the restaurant, if it's a high-end restaurant or a fast food restaurant, menu pricing is going to change. The model cannot exist with compressed pricing. We accurately, as I think I mentioned this earlier in the call, have been unable to charge the accurate amount that needs to be charged so that we can not just remain profitable, but also do more for our staff. Here's the truth. Most restaurant workers work at or slightly above minimum wage. Minimum wage is not a livable wage. And we have to do more for the people who work in this industry. People who work in the restaurant industry are paid hourly. They are paid at minimum or slightly above minimum. They do not get things like health insurance. They do not get personal time off. They do not get paid vacations. They do not get benefits that probably every one of you sitting on this call, wherever you work, you get without even thinking about. Yet the restaurant is the largest private employer in the United States. Just think about that. These are things. This is part of the model that needs to change. It is no longer right for people to expect value menus to mean the most amount of food for the cheapest amount of money, because there are some hidden costs to society in that cheap menu pricing. And I think it's the hidden costs that we're talking about today. The hidden cost is the vulnerability of the restaurant itself and the vulnerability of restaurant workers.
So to that end, another question came in. Will tipping remain a customary practice? And I know that some restaurants are eliminating tipping around the country. So will that continue, do you think, or will prices just go up to meet the need?
Tipping is a historic practice. It goes all the way back to, it goes back to the beginning of restaurants. It goes back to times when the people who were being tipped were not being paid, so they were living on their tips. It is an archaic and an incredibly inequitable way for restaurant workers to make money. Tipping only benefits a server. And there is remarkable inequality and inequity in pay structures in restaurants that exist because of the tipping model. Front of the house people, servers, get paid significantly more because of tips than back of the house workers who are hourly or salaried and usually paid at a lower amount than a tip server. So yes, I do think that we're right at the beginning of discussing whether or not the restaurant model will in the future include tipped employees. I can't answer to that. I can't give a definitive answer to that. Restaurants that have already stopped using the tipping model are usually very well-funded restaurants that exist in very large cities where density of population is huge. And there are some other factors that allow them to go to a tip-free model. I don't think that we are there yet, but it's something that I would absolutely consider in the future.
We are about 5 minutes away from
Is there another question?
ending the program. George, is there another question there that we can?
Yes, there's one more question. Ari Hodis asks particularly about the Patachu Foundation, if they can or are doing anything to deal with the issue of food deserts in some of the poorer neighborhoods in the city. And a bigger question about why grocery stores don't exist in those neighborhoods.
Well, grocery stores don't exist in food deserts because if they existed in food deserts, there wouldn't be a food desert. They don't exist in food desert because they are for-profit businesses. And the one industry that has even thinner models than restaurants is the grocery industry. So when you're talking about a profit margin of 1 or 2%, you have to make sure that you have clientele that will pay for the food. And poor people, unfortunately, don't have access to money to pay for food, or we wouldn't have the problem with food insecurity. The Patachu Foundation serves children who live with pervasive food insecurity. And our model is serving children who live in areas that are defined as food deserts. But truthfully, that too is a very complex subject because food deserts are the result of city planning that has systemic racism as part of the plans. They are part of planning that has bridged off people who need. And these are really complex questions with very, very complex answers that I don't think I can give justice to. Food insecurity, poverty, all tie in together, and you cannot extricate one without talking about the other. And issues for poverty in our country imply that there is need for true systemic change regarding how we deliver goods, how we deliver housing, how we deliver food and education, and most all, how we open up opportunities for people.
I think that that is a wonderful moment in which to conclude this conversation and thank Martha and the entire Patashtu family for providing us with a business model that is infused by ethical values and maintaining that important balance as a model for our entire community that can be emulated in so many different spheres. Martha, thank you for being with us tonight. We are grateful for what you have brought to our community, and we appreciate your friendship and support also of our congregation and your willingness to spend this time with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Happy birthday, Jackie. Thank you also for April and Julie for being on this call as supporters and advocates of the Patashtu Foundation. Truly appreciate everything.
Thank you. We continue the cocktail, the Judaism conversation on Monday, June 1st at 7:30 p.m. Via Zoom conferencing. I will be hosting a conversation that will be moderated by Rabbi Jenny Greenspan, and the topic is Gay Pride, supporting Indie Pride. Will involve members and activists of the LGBTQ+ community to discuss events of the forthcoming Indie Pride, challenges facing the LGBTQ+ community, and how the Jewish community can show its support. So we look forward to having you participate in that conversation. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Jackie, for keeping us connected, along with Shari. They are our Zoom police, and they do a wonderful job of keeping the conversation going. George, thank you for handling the conversations, and thank you, President Fox, for being with us and the entire community. And thank you to my colleague and co-host tonight.
And to mine.
And to mine.
And we look forward to eating at one of your Patashtu restaurants in the near future.
Okay, send us an email when you're ready to open. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks.